Um, Once more, maybe somebody came in during the prayer or something. Does anybody need a copy of today's lesson? I actually do have some printed out. Anybody else? Okay. In recap, some may think, well, you're wasting time going back and over the same thing over and over again. But that's the first 3 rules of teaching: repetition, repetition, repetition. So we're going to go back over it one more time. In the beginning, man was placed in the Garden of Eden where he had direct access to God. He talked to him face to face. Man sinned. And ever since that time, man has been trying to get back to that Garden of Eden. And as we pointed out, even the atheists have some kind of a concept of wanting to get back to that Garden of Eden. They have a word called utopia. Paradise, there are many novels that are written about paradise and a utopian world, and mankind would love to have that some kind of a system where we're safe, where there's no risk to be taken. And some would try to make that into earthly kingdoms to try to do that. And there are some political leaders that promise that from time to time. And they can never bring it about because it's never going to happen on this earth. But man has been trying to get back to that. God instituted, he had it before the foundation of the earth in place, the plan. But he instituted that plan, brought it to fruition at the time that man sinned to bring man back to a Garden of Eden on this earth. But he couldn't bring it about immediately because man was not ready for it. And so it took, if you use Archbishop Usher's chronology, about 4,000 years to get that plan to final fruition. And that's not really the end of God's plan, because God actually does have a Garden of Eden that's better than the earthly Garden of Eden that we can work our way toward. And in that sense, his people are going to be completely safe. And they're not going to have they're going to have work to do. We all are going to have work to do in heaven, but the outcome of that work is going to be certain and safe, and there will be no risk taken. There's no guessing about what's going to come of our work. And so we kind of started there, and then we moved into what was God's design for that. And we talked about the children of the Israelite nation. They were brought to that after the patriarchal dispensation worked for a while. Then God picked out a special people, and he brought them into a kingdom that Moses gave the law about and designated. So we're going to call that the Mosaic kingdom, just for purposes of something to call it. And in that kingdom, man was born into it. And but we talked about how that God never really wanted man to just be born into his kingdom. He required something more from them. And then Christ came and died on the cross, and in the kingdom of Christ, which he established, we're born into it by faith in him. We're not just given a physical birth. Being raised in the Church of Christ and being baptized by that famous gospel preacher that held meetings all over the country, and so that doesn't make you a member of Christ's kingdom. You have to be ushered in by faith. And so there's been a change made in how we get into the kingdom and how we stay in the kingdom. Now, it might be said, and this is one of those trite little phrases that breaks down pretty quickly once you really start thinking about it, but the kingdom of Israel, or the kingdom of Moses, one got into by birth, and the kingdom of Christ, one gets into by faith. Now, as we say, there are some, and we're going to break some of that down here in just a minute. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 12 through 22. And whoever gets there first, let's read that.
Deuteronomy 10 what?
Deuteronomy 10, verses 12 through 22.
Now Israel, what does the Lord your God require from you? But to fear the Lord your God, walk in all his ways, and love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the Lord's commandments and his statutes which I am commanding you today for your good. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the highest heavens, the earth and all that is in it. Yet on your fathers did the Lord set his affection to love them, and he chose their descendants after them, even you above all peoples, as it is this day. So circumcise your heart, and stiffen your neck no longer. For the Lord your God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who does not show partiality, nor take a bribe. He executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and shows his love for the alien by giving him food and clothing. So show your love for the alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, you shall serve him and cling to him, and you shall swear by his name. He is your praise, and he is your God, who has done these great and awesome things for you, which your eyes have seen. Your fathers went down to Egypt, 70 persons in all, and God the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven.
Okay. So now, the law of Moses, it has been said, was a law of works, where the man that was given to the outward works of the man, and the law of Christ is the law of faith. Is that correct? I don't agree with yes with caveats. I won't even give it that much credence. I was raised believing that, being taught that. There was a series of workbooks that were out that were used, at least at Temple Terrace congregation. I think they were pretty widely used among brethren in local churches around, that had that idea as a theme of the workbook series. And I cannot, it was a guy that lived in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I cannot remember his name, it saved my life. But he wrote a series of workbooks and taught that in the workbooks. The fact is that God was just as concerned about the heart of man under the law of Moses as he is under Christ. He chose the Israelites by physical birth, but he did not expect them to remain Israelite by simply being born and by doing certain things. They had to do them for the right reason. And the fact is that all throughout the history of the Israelite nation, God only ever had a remnant of people. You think about that for a minute. The Israelite nation was not saved as a nation. There were only a few of the children of Israel that were ever saved, because there were only a few that really got it and turned to God with all their heart. Tom.
The old law is a schoolmaster that leads us to the new covenant, or where we are right now. The old law, in order for those people to desire to keep those commandments, required a commitment of the heart. Otherwise, it became something that was just ritualistic. And it's the same thing today. Faith was a big deal then. The only deal then, it's the only deal now.
Okay.
But, it was more of a materialistic thing, a sacrificial thing in the Old Covenant, where now, it's a spiritually sacrificial thing. But there really isn't much difference.
Okay.
I think the key component is circumcision of the heart. In physical circumcision, you have a piece of skin that is cast away. And I think that's a key component that a lot of people miss when they consider circumcision of the heart. You're taking what holds you to the world, you're cutting it out, and you're casting it away. Once it's cast away, it should never come back. It doesn't, it doesn't. But it is an action that we need to perform, a physical action that we need to perform to show obedience and to show commitment.
Okay? A lot of times people, we get confused when we look at the old law, and we look at all of these laws that were given for the day-to-day rules for living, and what shall you do with the ancient landmarks that marked off the property boundaries, what's going to happen if an ox gores another ox, or an ox gores the neighbor of the person that owns the ox, and all of these little things, all of these day-to-day laws that were given in the law of Moses. And we get confused with that, and we think, well, it was just a law of works. No, it wasn't. All of these things were given to the nation of Israel because they needed to understand how to live their life. And they needed to understand what God wanted done in cases like where a young girl lost her virginity. Well, if she was in the city and she did not cry out, she was to be stoned to death, because then it was fornication. If she cried out and no one came to help her, then she was raped, and the rapist had some penalties. If the girl was out in the country, then you let her go and you take care of the man, because she could have cried out in the country and nobody heard her. Okay? So those kind of things had to be established. But we look at those things and we get hung up on them, and we forget that the very first commandment that God gave to Israel was, thou shalt what? What was the greatest commandment?
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, Mark, with all your strength.
And what's the greatest commandment today? Same thing. Has there really been a change? Not really. Not on that basis. It's always been about the heart. Now, before we go further, what is the heart? This thing in my chest that pumps blood, right? What's the heart when we talk about the heart from the biblical, spiritual perspective? The mind, and what else could we say?
How about if I read lesson 6?
Go ahead and read it from lesson 6. I think it's said just completely right there. Vine's got it right, I think.
The word heart is used nearly 1,000 times in the Bible, where it predominantly refers figuratively to the seat of thought, emotion, and will. Note the thoughts of your heart. Love God with all your heart and obey from the heart. Vine's Dictionary of New Testament Words says it came to stand for man's entire mental and moral activity, used figuratively for the hidden springs of the personal life. Peter sees it as the hidden person in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 4, the real person. Hence, not one really is, what one really is, or who one really is. And this may signify either a good or bad character.
Okay, so we might substitute the word character in there. The real person could be put in there. The emotion, the thought, and the will. I think all three of those would have to be put in there together if we're going to define what the heart is. It's the real person. Not just the guy when he stands up in this podium and he's teaching Bible class. But what do I do when I walk away from here? What do I do when I'm out in the world? And how do we understand what a man's heart is? How can we understand what a man's heart truly is? By his actions. There we are. Simple as that. Yes.
I think it's a lot like as I interpret it, my own son, I think it's a lot like body memory. You see somebody on a basketball court, let's say, because I had a lot of basketball in my past history being in Hoosier. You see somebody on the basketball court, you throw them the ball, it's innate. They know exactly how to dribble. They don't have to know it. They don't have to think about it. It is part of their nature. It's part of them. It's their character. And you know that in every case, given the correct circumstances, they're going to make that layup. They're going to make that jump shot. They're characterized for that. And it's that unthinkingness that is that heart that you're talking about, and obedience to God. You know that person, under any circumstances, if absolutely positive, will never do anything against the will of God.
Okay. So God always wanted this for his people, but he didn't always get it from the nation of Israel. But the nation of Israel was not the people that he really wanted to be his. They were an interim, you might say, rule or system to bring man along so that God could eventually, at the proper time, put in place the system that he really wanted, which he did in Jesus Christ. And we talked about last week what really went forth from Jerusalem. Was it an ecclesiastical body, like the Catholic Church says it was? Was it a little red wagon, like the Protestants say? Let's get rid of the word church. I'm going to try for the rest of this study not to use that word, because when I read the word church, in my mind it automatically means assembly. But sometimes it gets befuddled up, and I get that denominational, worldly definition in my head, and excuse my thinking. I'm going to try and use the word that ecclesia really means, and that's assembly. What went forth from Jerusalem? It was the assembly. What went forth from Jerusalem? It was the kingdom. What went forth from Jerusalem? It was the body. What went forth from Jerusalem? Was it a temple to which man could come? No. The temple became the people of God. That's what went forth. And that's just using a few of the terms that are used to describe the people of God in the New Testament. That's what went forth from Jerusalem. The Word went forth and created all of this, and it continues to create the same thing every time the Word is applied, as one fellow said, as writ, to the hearts and the minds of people. They become the people of God. And if you go out to an island out in the, let's see, we're closer to the Atlantic. Say there was an island out in the Atlantic that had never been discovered before, and there were some people living on it that had never heard the Word of God before, and my Bible, wrapped it up in a plastic bag so it would last, and threw it in the ocean, and it floated over and came up on the shores of that island, and somebody found it, and they started opening it, and they read it, and they began to teach it to their neighbor, and their neighbor understood it, and they baptized each other. Have they become the people of God? Absolutely. And a local church has been started there. Because this word will always accomplish God's will wherever it goes when it's properly applied to the hearts and minds of any person. I don't care who it is. So I'll just throw the question out here now. Are we properly applying it to our lives and our hearts and minds? That's not a question we need to answer in class. It's a question that each one of us needs to answer for ourselves at home, or in this class, or wherever we are. When you're driving down the road, are you still a Christian? One fellow said, I've known a brethren that get behind the wheel of a car and become a different person. And so, are you still a Christian when you get behind the wheel of a car? You ought to be. Some people aren't. In Romans chapter 2, let's just turn over there, and let's read verse 29. And really, when you get home, if you haven't done this, read the whole second chapter to get the context. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart by the Spirit, not by the letter, and his praise is not from men, but from God. Now, we can talk here about the idea of the Pharisee and the sinner that went up to the temple to pray, and the Pharisee said, "Oh God, you're so lucky to have me on your side, and I'm such a great person, and I'm not like this sinner over here." And the sinner would not lift his eyes to heaven, but just said, "God, be merciful to me. I'm a sinner." And Jesus said it was the sinner who went down to his house justified, not the man who thought he was. It's not something that we do because we've earned it. It's something we do because we submit to the will of God. I read an article that I think applies to this about being strong only when we're weak. A lot of times brethren will think, "Oh, I'm a strong Christian." There are no strong Christians. Paul said that he wasn't strong. He was only strong when he recognized his weakness and submitted to the will of Christ. I can't be a strong Christian until I'm willing to become so weak that I let God take over. And God will make me strong. But that's nothing to glory in, because I haven't done anything. God did it all. I'm a sinner. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And that's all I am, as a sinner. The difference between me and the drunk in the gutter is God's forgiven me. Because I've submitted to Him. If I haven't submitted to Him, and if I'm a Pharisee, then I can be standing up here, teaching this Bible class and go to hell. So I need to be careful about that. And I need to be careful about using myself as analogies for strength too. That's right. Because, tomorrow I could fall flat on my face. And I better keep that in mind. Let him who thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Turn to Hebrews chapter 11. Let's read verse 6.
But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him.
Hebrews 11 is called the what chapter? The chapter of faith. Okay. By almost everybody. By denominationalists, by brethren in Christ. Is Hebrews 11 all about faith alone?
Not obedience. The confidence in God to believe Him and obey Him, to look forward to the promises that He's laid out for those who love Him. It's summed up, I think, in the first 3 verses of chapter 12. I think that's the conclusion to chapter 11.
Okay. God is, we come to Him by faith, but He is a rewarder of those that do something. So our faith has to be a working faith, does it not?
James says so.
That's what Hebrews 11 is all about. By faith, Abraham did something. By faith, Noah built an ark. By faith, this one. By faith, that one. By faith, an unnamed host were burned at the stake, were sawn in two. They did something with their faith. There's only one verse of Scripture in all the Bible that talks about faith only. Does anybody know where it is? I'll give you, James, okay. I was going to give you a hint. Luther called it that strawy epistle because he didn't like it. Remember what chapter? 2. And it says faith only what? You can paraphrase.
Without works is dead.
Without works is dead. Same thing that Hebrews 11 says. James just puts it in different words. Now, God calls us, and that's his end of the stick, if you will. What's our end of the stick?
Pick up the phone and answer.
Okay. Hebrews 11:6. To come to him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him.
You know, it's interesting when you look at Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, where he says that those who seek him must seek him in spirit and in truth. His truth. I mean, there's, seek is an action word, and how are you going to do it? In spirit and in truth. That takes into account, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. It's a pretty consistent message, isn't it?
Yes. It's a very consistent message. There are those that will try to tell you that there was the Pauline church and the Jamesian church and the Petrine church, and they all taught different things, but Paul, when he was accused of teaching something different than the rest of the apostles, went back to meet with the rest of the apostles. And what chapter of Acts was that again? 15, thank you. In Acts 15, and what was the purpose of that meeting? Was it to determine what was to be done about those who were Gentiles who were coming into the church, whether they ought to be circumcised or not? No. It was to show that they all taught the same thing. Paul was already teaching the truth, and those people that came down as Judaizing teachers that said, oh, the rest of the apostles aren't teaching this, they were liars. And this letter that went out from Jerusalem showed their solidarity in that it was not to determine what doctrine was. It was to set forth in writing and for all time what God had already determined in heaven, that they were to declare upon the earth, as Jesus promised them was going to happen. Matthew 16:18, Matthew 18:18.
It was not for Paul to determine whether he was preaching the right gospel or not. He already foreknew what he taught was correct.
Mm-hmm.
I think he went to Jerusalem because that's where the saying came from, that the Gentiles could not be a part of the group.
Well, those teachers, the Judaizing teachers, were coming from Jerusalem and saying, oh, this isn't what they're teaching down in Jerusalem. This isn't what the rest of the apostles are saying, when it was. Now, Paul had this war, he says, going on within him. In Romans, he talks about this. Romans 12 is actually a culmination of everything that he's talked about prior to that. Let me just say that if you only memorize one chapter of the Bible in your life, perhaps it should be Romans 12. I'm not saying that's the only one you should. I'm just saying if that's all you've got in you to memorize Romans 12. You may disagree with that, and I'm not going to argue with anybody on that. That's just my opinion. But Romans 12 is just, it's all in there. It's a culmination, like I say, of everything in the first 11 chapters. But Paul talks about in Romans this war that went on between him in himself constantly, and he talks about his mind versus the flesh. Now, the Gnostics taught that everything that was physical and fleshly was evil. And they developed this system that wasn't anywhere in the Bible, of course, but that there were 20-something, I can't remember exactly how many now, but 20-something degrees of separation between the physical world and God. And God could have nothing to do with the physical world at all because it was evil. So when God came down to the world in the form of Jesus Christ, he wasn't really here. And when he walked, he did not leave footsteps. This is actually in some of their writings. And remember the time that he appeared to the disciples after his resurrection and he just appeared into the room? Well, this was because he didn't leave footsteps when he walked. He could just walk right through the walls. which he could, but, you know, still, that was saying he wasn't a physical entity. And I have a little problem with that because he told Thomas, who doubted, here, reach your hand into the nail prints in my hands. Put your hand into my side and feel it. And be not unbelieving, but believing. There's no indication Thomas did that, by the way. Thomas, it indicates, fell down and said, my Lord and my God.
Also, he ate with them.
Yeah, he ate a piece of fish at one time because they thought he was an apparition. So give me a piece of fish, and he ate it. Well, if he was an apparition, that piece of fish would have just, fallen down on the floor. But he wasn't. He was real. And so the contrast, what I'm getting at here is the war that was going on between Paul was not between his spirit and his physical personage, but he's using these as I had the word in my head just a minute ago. Figurative language is what I was trying to say. He's using figurative language to talk about the fact that God is always trying to invite us and pull us toward doing the right thing, and somebody else is always over here trying to pull us toward doing the wrong thing. Who would that be? I better get an answer on that one. And it's not Jesus Christ in this case. That's the devil. We got this war going on with us all the time. And just when we think we got the devil licked and he's going to flee far from us, he comes back. Pardon me?
Said he'll pop up again.
Right. He'll flee far from us, but as soon as we think he's gone, that's when he's going to come back. Therefore let him who thinketh he standeth take heed, lest he fall. Paul did not claim to be free from sin as a servant of Christ. He just claimed to be forgiven. He called himself the chiefest of sinners. I can understand, quite frankly, why the church in Jerusalem didn't want anything to do with him at first. Because of all the damage that he had done to the local churches around, and all of the people that he had executed, and all the people he had put in prison, and now here he comes in saying, I've been converted. Are you going to let that kind of fella in to the worship assembly?
Well, the first thing they probably asked is, are you sure about that, buddy?
Yeah. Are you sure? And then Barnabas comes in and says, no, I'm an eyewitness. Paul has changed. And then they immediately accepted him in. Jesus said that out of the heart proceed evil thoughts and murders and adulteries and fornication, thefts, false witness, and blasphemies. So, regardless of how we seek to hide our innermost spirit and even cover it with outward acts of goodness, the devil is always there trying to pull us in that wrong direction. And we got to be careful. It's not a war of the physical flesh against the spiritual spirit, if I'm making myself clear there. It's a war against the Spirit of God versus the spirit of the devil. So it's a spiritual war, but Paul uses this accommodative terminology to talk about the spirit versus the flesh. I have a fleshly desire to eat. And frankly, sometimes I eat too much. And I become a glutton, and gluttony is a sin. But my body likes to put food in it. And when I give in to that too much, is that really just a physical problem? No. It's a spiritual problem because my mind should have control over my body. Paul said, the stomach for food, the food for stomach to the Corinthians, and he said the body is for sex, but sex is not, I've got this reversed. sex is for the body, but the body is not for sex. You know, we're not made to just go out and just commit fornication with everybody we meet. God put that desire in our bodies, and He said, in marriage it is honorable and the bed is undefiled. It has a purpose. Eating has a purpose. It sustains life. But when we go out and we become gluttons, and we're just, roly-poly all over the place, we have abused that thing that God put in us that is naturally a good thing. Just like all of our physical desires are good things when they are used in the way that God intended for them to be used. So we've got to control our bodies with our hearts, not this heart, this heart. Our character, our real self, has got to be controlled by what we know to be the truth. And that is what makes us the people of God in this dispensation. Not being physically born in, but being spiritually born in. Does that all make sense? All right, our time is up. So we'll start on page 22, then on Thursday night, finish up the class Thursday night. Thank you.